Good morning. Thank you. I'll give you 5, and then you got 10 on here, but some of the 5 overlap. I'm one of those creative types, so if you're looking for the exact 5 to correspond, they won't. So here are the 5 just right out front. I think you have an outline, right? Schedule, cluster, outline, transition, polish. So let me begin by saying that writing, and we're talking specifically about academic writing today, which is a little different from creative writing, although if you will use some of the same principles from creative writing, some of which we'll talk about today, it will make you a better academic writer. So let me just begin by saying writing is not like masonry in that, think of a beautiful brick wall that someone has built. Do you think that was their first wall? No. There's a lot of thousands and thousands of trial and error on something somebody isn't paying for before you're actually really good. And sometimes people think that writing is sort of like magic, that you're either born with a gift or you're not born with a gift. And what that does is for people who work really hard to write, it really undermines all their hard work. But it also can be an excuse for if you're not a great writer to say, well, I just don't have the gift. And the reality is that writing, like anything else, has some rules, and it's a craft. If you spend 10,000 hours at it, you'll be pretty good at it, assuming you don't make all the same mistakes for the same 10,000 hours. So in that way, I like to think of it as being like building a wall. And the first place to begin when you have an assignment, and I hope that you came with an assignment in mind today because it will be much easier for you to think concretely if you have something in mind. The first thing to do is to make a calendar. And you put the due date on the calendar and work backwards. And I suggest that you just Google calendar template, find one that you like, and it needs to be big enough that you can write daily assignments on it. And part of what can be overwhelming for a term paper, or, paper that's 20 pages long, or if you have a thesis to write, can be overwhelming to just look at, there's a deadline and I have all that stuff due. And if you're one of those people who hates to write and it's really, really work for you, I recommend that you spend 20 minutes a day. For those of you for whom writing is not that terrible, you can have a little more flexibility. But for those for whom it's really, really hard work, if you know you only have to do 20 minutes a day, it makes it more manageable. And the reality is once you get into the 20 minutes, you usually, you're in the groove and spend a little longer. But it's less overwhelming if you break it into smaller parts. So what you do is start with the due date, work backward, and allow yourself a day of rest. Okay? What you don't want to be doing is working 7 days a week, sun up to sundown, because it'll sap your creativity. I like to think that creativity is a lot like lace, in that what makes it beautiful is the holes, not the fabric. And sometimes our lives are just plain fabric, and you need a little time when you're writing for things to germinate. And also, haven't you noticed if you write something and you look at it and the next morning and you go, this really stinks, because you're looking at it with fresh eyes? So you need to factor in fresh eyes as part of the editing process, right? But you usually, if you're right up against the deadline, you don't have that luxury. So factor in a day of rest or time for it to just sit, and then factor in a couple of different edits. And if you can, I really encourage you, especially if you're an international student for whom, or anybody for whom the English is not your first language, we tend to, in different languages, use prepositions differently, right? And so if you can trade services with somebody else who will read it for you, but don't just ask them to read it for you, offer to do something, like work out a deal where win-win. They're a student, you're serving each other. You might be able to read somebody's paper not for its grammar or punctuation, but you can read it for content and clarity. And so find a writing partner or two where you just agree, I'll do this for you, you do this for me. And you have sort of the peer review going on where you ask that person, is it clear? Is it logical? Where are my weakest points? And anything else I should know. All right, so give yourself the opportunity at the end to have that sort of an edit, and don't give it to that person at midnight when it's due the next morning at 7:45. So give at least a couple of days for that, and then as you're working backwards, your main body, give yourself about 3 days to write that. Another full day to write a full sentence outline, and we'll talk about all these things in a minute. Then you want to draft your intro, conclusion, and transitions at a separate time from when you're crafting the body of your piece, right? So, and I encourage you to, so as you get in chronological order, you're going to be writing your outline first, then your introduction and your conclusion and transitions before you write the paper, okay? So that you have the flow of logic before you have to fill it all in. So again, we're working backwards, right, to today. So you want to create the full sentence outline. Before that, you want to give yourself time to research. Before that, you want time to cluster, and we'll talk today about what that is. And then time to just to organize. So don't underestimate how long it takes to actually come up with a topic, right? Sometimes, especially if you're working on a thesis or a longer project, it can take an entire semester to really nail down what it is that you want to do. And so often people just, when we make our schedules, we start with when I need to start writing. And there's so much time involved in thinking. You need to stare out the window and do some research and think some more, and we'll give you an exercise that you can do to help tap into both sides of the brain to figure out what you want to do, to write, what subject you want to write on. Okay, so you have your 20 minutes a day minimum, and if that's the case, you need to start sooner, obviously, than if you can allow yourself an hour a day. Okay, but let me just say this. I was in charge of a media event that I really did not look forward to putting together. I am more the creative type, and organization is not my favorite thing. And it meant lots of correspondence, lots of working with press runs and deadlines and copy and all that, and I was putting it off. And so I basically did this for that event, where I told myself, you only have to work on it 20 minutes a day. You can survive 20 minutes a day. And that's literally what I did. I started a year out and worked on it 20 minutes a day, and it was really satisfying. And I managed to do it without pulling my hair out. So I brought some examples for you to see, but the technology's not working, of what it looks like to cluster. So if you'll, I'll just tell you I'm a writer, not a drawer. So I hope that you can see this, but basically let's use the example that we have. You have a Trinitarian paper, right? And let's assume that your professor has told you, I don't care what you write on, it can be anything that has to do with the topic of Trinitarianism. So it will not be this neat when you write your cluster, right? It's sort of free association, and this was just to get started. So you think, well, let's see, I could do poor applications like, what are some terrible analogies people have used to the Trinity? Well, it's like an egg with 3 parts, except, well, it's like steam and ice and water, except that it's not ever all those 3 at the same time. Or like you think of the efforts we have made to try to clarify it, and yet they don't quite hit, because nothing can really be an analogy to the Trinity, right? Then you can look at the historiography, which is basically the history of the history, looking at what histories of people were written on the ideas. Do I want to sort of trace this on a timeline through time? That might be something I might want to do. Or I could do different views on Trinitarian, or I could even, so then from that I could say, well, you've got the Augustinian view, and you've got Aquinas. You know, do I want to pick one of those and go with it? Or do I want to pick one aspect of the Trinity, and I'm going to go, do I want to do Father? Do I want to do Son? Do I want to do the Holy Spirit? And I think, I want to do the Son. Let me do something, let me think about incarnation for a while, right? You see how that works? Here's why you want to do this. Because the number one cause of writer's block is that the editor takes over before the creator had a chance to get out, okay? And the brain research says that this exercise draws on both sides of the brain. And the brain has its own self-organizing processes. So if you will draw on the brain's self-organizing processes, you will have an easier time coming up with ideas. So what we've settled on is we want to write about the Son. And so we start brainstorming, doing the same sort of exercise about the Son, and we think of what are some different names, and help me out here. What are some names for the Son? The Word. He's the morning star. What else? Bread of life. And then so then once you get to bread, you've got all those metaphors. I'm the light, I'm the water, right? And so, etc., all the metaphors. Then you have the Son is the head. and you think, okay, well, that interests me. Do I want to look at head of the church? It seems like there are two different ways head is used. You've got head of, which is usually got the word body in the church, and it's emphasizing unity, right? It's connectedness, like a head and a body. And then you have head over, which has to do with preeminence, power, authority, right? Yeah, that's what I want to write on. I want to write on the Son as the head of the church, and I want to look at, let me limit that to Pauline use instead of taking the Gospels. So you think, I want to look at the Pauline use of head related to the Son as head over. So this is the process of starting to figure out what topic you want to do. Then the same thing happens when you start organizing. Once you've done some research on it and looked at it, you start thinking, how do I want to organize this? Did you have a question?
Yes, ma'am. If you feel like you don't know enough about the subject, would you recommend doing the research and then doing?
Yeah, well, this will help you kind of know where you need to focus your research, right? So typically, if you're in a Trinitarian class, you've had enough lectures to kind of, know a general overview. But absolutely, you start looking at this, and then it tells you where you need to research, and then you do some research, and then you come back and do some more clustering, and that's all part of step one clustering, okay? Is figuring out, I'm interested in this, let me go see. Then you might research it and find, gosh, there's really not enough material on that. If there's not enough material, then I need to broaden this from Pauline to actually doing the whole New Testament, right? But if I find there's so much ink spilled on just head of, right, and the head of the church and the head of the body, that I'm not even going to do head over, right? It's a way of either eliminating or expanding. Usually for most students, they bite off more than they can chew. So they would do the whole New Testament when they maybe should just focus on Pauline, right? Okay, so that is the calendar process, the clustering process, and the clustering you don't just do one time. You do it throughout, especially if you feel yourself getting writer's block and looking at that screen knowing that editor has taken over and I need the artist, the creator, to come out and cooperate together. Okay? All right, your next step is your outline. And as I mentioned, you don't really want to get down here. You don't really want to write your introduction first, which is where most of us start, because you may not know until you've written the body of your paper what your conclusions are going to be, right? I mean, that's the whole point of research, right, is to find out things. And so, and you might, in the process of writing, discover that there's a good metaphor that you can sort of weave throughout. And that's the place to introduce it, is in the introduction and in the conclusion. So you can say those for last and just dive in. But again, before you actually start writing your paper, you write an outline. So, and not everybody's an outliner, and that's okay. I'm not talking about a super structured outline if that doesn't help you. But still, you need to have some kind of organization to know part one of this paper is going to cover this, part two, even that simple, just part one and part two, if that's what you need. So let's say part one is Christ as head of, and part two is Christ as head over. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look up all the references that have that and probably dump them in my file under those two sections and start accumulating data and quotes to fill out those two sections. And the next thing that you'll do is once you start filling out your sections is to actually write a full sentence outline. So your outline goes from just sort of stuff thrown in a file, thrown in to kind of start organizing it, to actually have full sentences. And the reason you want them to be complete sentences and not phrases is you're going to actually incorporate those sentences into your paper. So you're actually writing the paper even though you're writing an outline, right? So, for example, if you say, Christ as head of the church is a metaphor that communicates that Christ is united with the church as its head. Okay, statement like that. Christ as head over the church reminds the body of Christ that he is the authority over us all. Okay, so something that's a complete statement, you can make it beautiful later. Okay, you're just trying to figure out the logic of your paper right now. And then you go back and you write your transitions. And your transitions you've got your introduction, you got your conclusion, you got your 2 sections. And I mean write out full sentence outlines, the transition from the introduction into the body of it, the transition from part 1 to part 2. So your summary in part 1, we have seen that blah, 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 but Paul also says blah, blah, blah. And that's your transition to part 2, which is what he also says, head over. Okay, you with me so far? Okay, and then you write your conclusion. In summary, Christ is this, and you're finished. Okay, so you've written your conclusions and your introduction, your conclusion, and your transitions before you've cleaned up the middle section. So you're sort of figuring out the logic as you go. You're filling your middle section first with ideas and data and quotes and organization, and you're trying to make it logical. And then once you know what your argument's going to be, you can go back, write your intro, your conclusions, and your transitions. Excuse me, I strongly recommend, there's a little thin book that's overpriced called They Say, I Say, which we have in our library, but since everybody's going to be borrowing it now, you may not be able to find it. So put it on your Christmas list. It's like $28 for this little thin book, but it's gold in that it writes potential transitions for you. We have seen this, or as X says this, conversely, Y says this. Or in addition to X saying this, Y says this. So it just gives you this sort of fill-in-the-blank transitions for you to say, yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. And it helps you add this sort of logic to what you're writing. All right, so you've clustered, you've come up with an outline, you've crafted your transitions, and then you're going to write a really, really, really crummy first draft that nobody but you will see. All right? And the reason you're going to write a terrible first draft is because you don't want your editor to take over before the creator is finished. Okay? Again, that's usually where people get writer's block, is as they're writing, they're trying to make it perfect. Right? And it really slows you down. Just try to get it out, because it's much, much easier to edit something poor than to create something from nothing, right? And so what you want to do is get something yucky on there, but at least it's something, and then start cleaning it up, all right? So first draft, really bad, and nobody else is going to see it, so you don't have to feel humiliated or anything. That's not where you're going to stay. I usually go through 7 drafts when I'm writing something. Most of writing is rewriting. Repeat that with me, please. Most of writing is rewriting, okay? It is not getting it perfect the first time. And that's why we think that people are so amazing, because we think, we look at somebody dancing and think, wow, they're an amazing dancer. We don't see the rehearsal. We look at something someone's written and we don't see, yeah, that's their 7th draft. It wasn't that easy. They spent a lot of time cleaning it up. So here are ways to rewrite. The first thing you do is to clean up your logic. Peggy Noonan, who was the Reagan-Bush speechwriter, the Reagan-Bush speechwriter, who Ronald Reagan was sort of known as the great communicator. And she wrote a book called Strictly Speaking, where she talked about her sort of secrets to amazing speeches. And she said it's actually not the prose itself that makes a speech amazing, it's the logic. Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev, is not actually that brilliant in terms of prose, but something there is that doesn't love a wall, Robert Frost says, right? There's just something in us that says a wall shouldn't be there, shouldn't divide people. And so she said it's not that difficult to say something really moving if you have the logic, right? And considering that you are our Dallas Seminary, you basically have the words of life. I mean, you have 90% of what it takes to be a good writer is having something worth saying. You have something worth saying. People need to hear what you're going to say. So think through, does A follow to B? Does B logically follow A? Clean up the logic. Make sure that this argument, where do I need help? Make a little star. Here's where I need a better quote. Here's where I need to go back and get it better. The logic is what I need to focus on at this point rather than the beauty of the piece. Okay? And once you have the clarity down, you are clear what you want to say, clarity being number 1, then you go back and you look at your verbs. And the number 1 thing that you want to do as you're, I can see some of my former students smiling. What is my little mantra? Yeah, strong verbs. I've been called the be verb czar, okay? And that doesn't insult me. Because the verb to be is so boring, there are languages that just skip it, right? Man, good, right? Blessed the man who, because is just such a boring word, you don't even need it. This equals that. So look for places that you have uninteresting verbs like has and is and are and am. And ask yourself, is there a more interesting way that I can say this? Now, clearly, if you have Darth Vader is, spoiler alert, Darth Vader is Luke's father, okay? There's really only one way to say that, which is, because it would sound silly to say Darth Vader begat Luke, right? Or Darth Vader, if you say he fathered him, that really kind of suggests he nurtured him, and he really didn't, right? So there are places where this equals this really is the best place. And every time Jesus uses metaphor, right, I am the light, I am the bread, it's not that is a bad thing in those situations. It's just that academic writing is usually filled with boring verbs and passive voice, right? So what you want to do is, if you have a sentence like the human body is the metaphor Paul uses to emphasize oneness, you could say Paul uses the metaphor of a body to emphasize oneness, or Paul favors the metaphor, Paul chooses the metaphor, something that just sort of beefs it up. And so number one tip is use strong verbs. All right, repeat that with me, please. Use strong verbs. Yes, I know this is juvenile, but that's how you learn it, right? Use strong verbs, not boring verbs. The second tip, if you take nothing else away but these three tips, you'll be a much stronger writer. The second is to use active voice, especially in academic writing, because since everybody else uses it, including all the journals that you read, then you will stand out as an amazing writer because you will be so much further above everybody else who's using passive voice. And passive voice eliminates the subject. So here's a sentence in passive voice. A metaphor of a body is used to emphasize oneness. Who uses it? Paul, right? So Ashley said, who's the subject? Okay, so you change it to Paul uses instead of it is used, right? So go and you can set your word processing. Word will underline it in green if you have passive voice. It will tell you. It will even offer you an option to improve it, okay? So for some of these, it's easy to just turn on whatever grammar and punctuation helps you have in Word, and it will help flag some of those for you. You can use your word processor the same way for boring verbs. If you put space, is, space, and find all the instances of is, you can even change it. I change it sometimes to like 5 Z's, right? So that it jumps out at me, and I still might keep the boring verb, but it has to ask permission at the door to stay in there, right? Okay, so you have, first is use strong verbs. The second one is use active voice. The third one is to turn negations into assertions, okay? Turn negations into assertions. And the reason that you want to turn negations into assertions is especially the way the brain processes the English language. So let's say he was not. As you're reading this sentence, so far all you can picture is a he, right? You don't have any sort of image to picture here until you get to the word happy, right? So he was not, and then you picture a happy and then you negate it, okay? So you have to picture something that's an assertion and then unassert it. And it takes the brain 48% longer to process it. And have you ever been reading something and you go, what? And then you realize you just completely skipped over the word no or not, and you read the exact opposite? Okay, the brain does that because of the way we read linearly. So if you're going to make an assertion out of he was not happy, well, what was he? You could either say he was sad, or you could even just say he was unhappy, right? So you want to say what he was, not what he was not. You're not changing the meaning any, right? Okay, well, let's say I don't want a boring verb, right? So the next step, first I'm going to change the negation into an assertion. He was sad. How do you know somebody's sad? How can you tell? What's he doing that tells you that? Facial expressions. Okay, so give me a facial expression that says you're unhappy. Frown. All right, so he frowned. All right, that's much better writing. because you picture immediately a frowning person. And then you deduce he's unhappy. That little deduction, he's unhappy, the reader loves, because it assumes a smart reader. It assumes you're smart enough to figure out that a frowning person is an unhappy person without me telling you what it means. And that's how people get lost in a story, is they get to make these little discoveries of assessment that you don't make. And that's why you hear the phrase show, don't tell. You've shown his unhappiness rather than telling somebody he's unhappy, right? But that's sort of advanced writing, right? We're just settling on some basic right now, which is turn your negations into assertions, strong verbs. Okay, so number one, use strong verbs. Second is use active voice. Third is turn negations into assertions, okay? Any questions? That makes sense? All right, let me just give you some examples. Instead of the ducks were not eating the food, the ducks refused the bread, okay? So you can make food even more specific, but the main thing is instead of what they weren't doing, they weren't eating, they were doing something which was refusing it, okay? Or did you ever go swimming and the mothers at the pool are yelling to their kids? The parents are told, don't say, don't run. What are we told to say? Walk, right? Same kind of thing. Because for a kid to hear don't run, they're like, what do I do? But if you just tell them what to do, they'll do it, okay? So it's just sort of one more layer of having to process and it keeps readers from getting lost in your logic, getting lost in your argument, because they're so busy trying to figure out what your argument is. So it just makes it easier for your reader. All right, now we're going to talk about some punctuation errors. All right, so for example, let's say you have a sentence, the book of Rev, period, says God will wipe away every tear, parentheses, Revelation 21:4. All right, here's what's wrong with that. First of all, make sure the word book is capitalized when you're using Bible books. That is not true everywhere and always. That is a DTS style manual thing, okay? And there are a number of punctuation tips that you need to know that are part of Kate Turabian and the Chicago Manual of Style, which is the same thing. The DTS style manual flags some of these, and someday we might do Turabian Nights like Arabian Nights. I don't know. There's a sort of a love-hate relationship, right, that we have with Kate. But so book should be capitalized. Rev in a sentence should be spelled out. You should always spell out the Bible book. You can use one for 1 Timothy, but you don't want to say 1 Tim says blah, 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 blah in your sentence. Save those for the parentheses where you're giving the address, right? So in the body of your sentence, spell out the Bible book. In the parentheses where you're giving the address, that's where you use abbreviated forms. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay, good. Now, let's talk to matching numbers, because this is the number one mistake people make in the English language. The number one mistake people make in the English language, including most of my writing students who are fairly advanced writers. It's just we don't match the number, right? So we say if someone smiles, return their greeting. Well, what's wrong with that? Someone is a one and there is a plural, right? So if someone smiles, smile back. Sometimes you can just eliminate gender altogether, right? If somebody smiles, smile back. Or you can say when people smile, return their greetings. But what you want is the number of people and the action, whether it's plural or singular, to match in number. So you could also alternate male and female. You could say something like, if someone smiles, return her greeting. If someone waves, wave back at him, right? It can be a little clunky, but it's still better than the unmatched numbers. So this could be really boring to just sit and hear some grammar rules. So just make yourself a note to maybe go online if that's a challenge for you and Google matching numbers in grammar, and they'll give you maybe some worksheets that you can work through to sort of nail it down. It's much better than you hear me give examples and trying to imagine in your head what I'm saying. Here's another challenge that we have is where do the periods go in relation to punctuation marks? And here's part of why this is such a challenge here. Because many of the books that you are reading are published by, let's say, Oxford University Press. And Oxford University Press is typically published in what country? The UK, yes. So what that means is they're going to say, if they were to do patty cake with a little child, they would say roll it and pat it and mark it with a B, and that's how they're going to punctuate it, right? But in America, this goes inside, all right? So here's probably what happens to you. You're thinking you memorize the rule, it always goes inside, and then you read a scholarly book and go, oh wait, I got that backwards because this has it outside, it must be right because it's Oxford. So then you do it on your papers and it's wrong, and you go, oh, I can never remember that, I thought I had it right. Well, that's why, because you're seeing it both ways, okay? But if you're writing in the US, you put it inside. If you're writing in Canada, put it on the outside. Sort of like color and color, right? The same, there are a number of things like toward and towards, toward in America, towards. And so some of you were taught the Queen's English, and that's why this is sort of a problem. Here's what you can do. As part of your editing process, you don't have to try to remember that and get shut down as you're trying to write. Just write that sloppy first draft, and as part of your editing process, do a search for a period and a dot outside of the period, outside of the quotes, right? And you do the same thing for singles, so that you find it and you can replace it. Does that make sense? Find and replace is your friend in the editing process, because you can kind of know what you have a tendency to do wrong, but that doesn't mean you have to be thinking about it, because it will give you writer's block if you're constantly thinking about it as you're trying to write. Just write that crummy draft where you're thinking about the logic and the argument rather than the punctuation, because that's why most of writing is rewriting. Okay. Same is true with the number of spaces after a period. Some of you had a typing teacher who taught you to put 2. Well, that was true on a typewriter. But with word processing, it's only 1. Only 1 space after a period. So again, you don't have to go back and fix all those. What you do is you do find and replace, right? You find space, space, and replace with 1 space. Yes. And it'll just do it throughout your whole document. Those are some of our favorites here at DTS. Some of our little punctuation issues. Let's see what else I have here. Dr. Barry Jones and Dr. Tim Baselin have a little statement in their syllabus that I think is really something that I really appreciate. And it's on using gender-inclusive language. And this is not like a feminazi issue, right? This is, let me just read you the statement, because I like what they say. All written submissions should strive to use gender-inclusive language. While this has become standard academic practice, this request is not merely an attempt at political correctness. As a gospel-shaped, gospel-centered community of learning, we have compelling reasons to think, write, and speak in a way that ensures that none are either intentionally or inadvertently excluded by the use of our language. So consider using humans, persons, humanity, or humankind rather than man or men when referring to human beings in general, and consider alternating between the use of he and she as generic pronouns when you're substituting the use of the plural they or their when appropriate. Okay, so here's one of the things that I've discovered in the classes that I teach here. The students who are writing in gender-inclusive language end up being glad later because their board of elders asks for a statement, or they say, oh, somebody hears about a paper they've written and wants to use it somewhere. And they finally have a broader audience because whenever they're writing papers, they're thinking somebody else may see this someday. I'm not just writing this to put in my file for my own research. I might put all my papers together in an ebook and make it available. One of my students, this was sort of interesting, he had written a Christian ed paper, and in the writing for publication class, I gave an alternative assignment where they could publish anything they had written as an ebook. And it could be 3 pages long. It didn't have to be. I just wanted them to go through the process of what is it like to publish an ebook. So he uploads his very well edited Christian ed paper, and a couple days later he gets a call from a Florida church, and they say, are you the author of this book? And he says, are you talking about that paper I put up on Smashwords? Yes, we've been looking for you. We have a job opening, and your philosophy is exactly what we need. And he's like, it was just a paper. And they're like, no, it was great. Can you fly to Florida? And so they hired him like a week before graduation. It was 2 years ago. So think about it, because it's not just something that you're doing in your own private life. The body of Christ can benefit from the thinking that you're doing in a much broader audience. And especially because English can be accessed by so many of the educated people in the world, right? You can get into countries that have border control that would never let you in, but you can skip the border by writing something that's of use to the church. So think in terms, both in terms of being gender inclusive, because that can get you, especially into some of the more liberal denominations, it will give you a hearing. I know with my own daughter, she's 19, and when she was about 7, I was reading her the Psalms one night, and I could tell she kind of mentally checked out. And I was looking at it, realizing it's him, he, he, who. And she goes to public school. So I just changed it to her, and she sat up in bed and said, "Finally, it's talking to me." And I had explained to her over and over sort of the editorial he. But the reality was she just didn't hear it. And so we have a whole generation coming up, right, that it's already here for whom they actually hear it when you use he as a gender discrimination thing, and we don't want that. All right, so next we have the Oxford comma. And again, the Oxford comma is one of those style manual things. If you were writing for the Associated Press, you would not use it. But because Turabian is sort of the magazine style, which is what most people use, then we are going to use that. And that's, again, one of those things where your English teacher might have told you one thing, and it's not that she was wrong, it's that she was not using a particular style manual. Okay, so all this to say, yes, some rules are fluid. Okay, some rules are fluid, but you got to know what the rules are here, right? Because if you don't know the rules here, what can happen? Yeah, you can get a crummy grade just for a stupid comma that you're, abusing over and over. Okay, so here's an example. The Oxford comma is the comma before the word "and" at the end of a list. All right, so let me take the sentence here. We invited atheists, Dr. Bach, and Dr. Wallace. All right? Now, right now, the atheists are Dr. Bach and Dr. Wallace. Okay? That's a bad thing. A little comma redeems their reputations. Okay? And it says there are 3 different groups we invited. These 2 scholars and the atheists. Okay? Commas are important. Okay? So that's why we like that Oxford comma here. If you have items in 3 things or 4 things or whatever, right after the and, yes, so Bach, comma, and, yeah, you're right. Before the and, that's what I meant. Thank you. All right, another factor that can greatly contribute to a lack of success here is failure to give proper credit where it's due, right? And my experience is it's usually not intentional, right? Usually we're not trying to cheat and plagiarize here. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, we want to be honest. So let's think about this a minute. Let's say you spend all this money on your education and do all this hard thinking, and somebody swipes your words and pretends they were his or her own. How does that feel? Kind of resentful? It's not right to pass off as your own work that is somebody else's. Not only that, by citing other people, we affirm that community is valuable. We affirm that we need each other. We affirm that somebody else has done a good job, and we're happy for them to get credit where it's due, just like we would appreciate it if somebody had that attitude toward us. So one of the ways, sometimes what can happen is you're dumping that information into sections A and B of your file, and you don't have proper attribution. And I recommend, this is where you can use your cell phone if you can take photos with it, or the photocopy machine, that when you are using a book, and you don't want to have to stop and get who was the publisher and what year was it. You just turn to the front page and take a photo so that it tells you who the author was and who the publisher was. And so then all your notes have to say is the last name of whoever published it and the page number, and you can keep going. And later you can go back and track down the sources. What you don't want to have to do is go back and find the book in the library for your source, right? You don't want to be sitting at home at 10 o'clock at night working on a paper and realize you don't have the source you need because you didn't do all the documentation. So that's a quick way to email it to yourself or to your friend if you need to. Cite your sources, keep track of it. Yesterday, I received an email from one of my students, and he said, why do people discussing theology so often disprove arguments the other side would never actually claim? Okay? And we have a tendency sometimes to want to make the opposition look stupid and our view to look brilliant. And so we can it's called the straw man, right? Or we distort in some way what somebody's saying. And one of the problems, there are a number of problems obviously with that, but what happens to our audience when they read us on that and they think we know, and then they go and read the other side, when they see how badly we've distorted the other side, they're pretty likely to convert to the other side, right? Because they didn't get a fair hearing in the first place. So truth is really important. And making sure, and again, there have been a number of times where I've ended up at dinner with someone with whom I disagreed, and I was really glad I hadn't trashed them in public. And it went the other way. I had a publisher one time treat me in an unjust way. And he ended up on campus, and when he saw me, he came right across the room and apologized. And that night we were in a room of 1,000 people and we just happened to end up at the same table together. And he looked at me and said, boy, am I glad I apologized to you this afternoon. Would have been really awkward sitting here if we still had that sitting between us. So imagine that you're that person, that if you are distorting somebody and you might have to end up at dinner with them, would you want to have communion with them? Would they want to have communion with you? Would they feel like you had fairly represented them? I'm a journalist, and I did an interview with somebody whose name you know. And I asked him, where have you felt the most misunderstood? And he basically said, by Christians who read my work and assumed bad motives on my part and just ripped me apart. My heart is for the body of Christ. And I don't mind them disagreeing, but to challenge my motives or to make me look stupid, and even I didn't agree with what I was supposedly saying. So it's really important that we are respectful. I think of John 17, where the Lord wants his church to be one. And this is one of the ways where we can contribute to that oneness. We think critically without being critics of everything, okay? We think critically, but we're not critical of everybody and everything. We need to have a certain generosity of spirit in our writing, where we say, like you would say to a good friend with whom you had a disagreement, I can see how you could see it that way. Doesn't mean I see it that way, but I can see how you got there. You're not an idiot to have arrived at that conclusion. It's just the gracious way to be. All right, so I said in the beginning that writing is like bricklaying, but in a sense, it's not in that. It's a little more like landing a plane. You've done all this work, and you're almost to your destination, but if you crash on the landing, you still have a big mess. And one of the ways that you land the plane, and I don't mean ending your paper, I mean just making the paper come together as a full unit, is whenever you have a quote, whenever you've quoted somebody, you don't end your paragraph or your paper with their quote. And you especially don't end it with a Bible verse or verses from a hymn, okay? That's called cheating, okay? You need to always follow somebody else's quote with your own statement. This is your writing. You are flying this plane. You're not turning the controls over to somebody else. So this is sort of a rule in academic writing, an unspoken rule, that when other academics read your work and see a quote hanging out there at the end of a paragraph that you don't come back and comment on or make the transition with, it's considered really lazy. So anytime you, again, as part of your search function, you're looking for quotation marks, maybe you have an ending quote and you didn't land that plane, get back at the controls and do a sentence to land it. All right, so here's where we've been. We've looked at, you figure out when your paper's due and work backwards. trying to put it in small tasks that are more doable, allowing for some time to rest and edit. We've looked at clustering and seeing how that you can tap into both sides of the brain, not just for creative writing, but for academic writing, both in the ideation process, figuring out what I want my topic to be, and also as you're going through the writing process, when you get stuck, you feel like you have writer's block, again, start thinking and free associating with where you can go next. Then you have your outline, and I'm not necessarily talking about the kind of super structured outline that you have been taught to do. Whatever works for you, but it needs to have logic, it needs to have structure, whatever the logic is for you, where you say, this follows this, which follows this. And then once you've filled in the middle, you go back, do your introduction, your conclusion, and your transitions. Once you've done all that, then you do all these sort of polishing things that we've talked about. What you don't want to do is put the polishing too early, right? You don't want to let the editor out of the cage before the creator and the logic person has had a chance to have his or her say. All right, any questions? Yes?
The dash.
The dash. Okay, there are 3 different kinds of I could say dashes. One is the hyphen. The hyphen is the littlest, and you would use it in a word like X-ray, right? It's short, tiny. You would also use it between maybe the crazy busy day, right? So you're taking 2 separate words and using them as one word. You would hyphenate those, right? All right, then the N dash, which is the length of a letter N. It's a little longer. And depending on whether you have a Mac or a PC, you access it differently. Again, Google an N dash and it'll tell you what to do. An N dash needs to go, let's say you're doing Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. That there should not be this. It should be this. It should be a little longer. Okay? So your bibliographies need to be full of N dashes, not hyphens. Right? Then the M dash is as long as a letter M. And that's what we usually just call a dash, which works like a comma, right? Let's see, I'm telling you this. You can't see that, right? Because I must run out of ink. I'm telling you, and then you have a dash sort of parenthetically, not because you need it, but, and then you go on, right? So the little rule of thumb on the M dashes is a comma would probably work just as well, but if you already have 4 commas in the sentence, it sort of helps keep this unit together. So you're using different lengths. That's M. The N is for numbers. You don't use it in phone numbers, but you do use it in your Bible verses. And then the short hyphen that goes between words. Good. Other questions? Did I see one up there? No? Nothing? Yes? But. Okay. So your English teacher might have taught you that you cannot begin sentences with and or but. If you will look at the King James Bible, I think you will see they went to pretty good schools, and they are constantly beginning sentences with those. So I don't see a problem with that at all. How about punctuating? Well, it depends on how you're using it in a sentence. If you're saying, I don't want to do that, but you can, what you have is sort of 2 mini sentences on either side, right? I don't want to, you can. So it needs it, because 2 independent clauses, which basically could be a standalone sentence. Anytime you have 2 separate independent clauses in a sentence, you want some kind of punctuation. And that's where people usually get messed up with the semicolon, because a semicolon shouldn't have an independent clause on one side and a phrase on the other. Whatever's on either side of a semicolon should be able to stand alone as a sentence.